In 1971, a single-income family, one person working a factory job, could buy a house, own a car, send kids to college, and still retire comfortably. No second job, no side hustle, no credit card debt cycling into the next month. Today, that same lifestyle requires two incomes, both people working full-time, and even then, statistically, they are still one medical. The answer is not laziness. It is not spending too much on coffee, and it is definitely not a lack of hustle. The answer is that the system is working exactly as designed. You are just not the one it was designed for. Why this matters right now. Before you think this is another doom and gloom rant, let's be precise. And here is why this matters in 2025 specifically. The gap between what middle-class life costs and what middle-class wages actually deliver has never been wider in modern history. The people most affected are not the poor. They have social safety nets, imperfect as they are. Here is a number that should bother you. Between 1979 and 2022, American worker productivity grew by roughly 64%. Wages, adjusted for inflation, grew by about 17% over the same period. Sit with that for a moment. Workers are producing dramatically more value per hour than they were 40 years ago. The economy is genuinely bigger. Corporate profits, shareholder dividends, executive compensation, and the compounding wealth of people who already owned assets, stocks, real estate, businesses, rather than people who showed up and traded time for money. This is the first hidden mechanism. Productivity gains were quietly decoupled from wages sometime in the early 1970s. It happened gradually enough that most people did not notice. They just noticed that raises were smaller, that their parents seemed to have done more with less, that the math of their own life did not quite add up. Now, layer in the second mechanism. Not everything has gotten more expensive. A flat-screen television that would have cost $3,000 in 1995 now costs $300. Flights are cheaper in real terms. Clothes are cheaper. Consumer electronics are cheaper. But there are 4 specific categories where prices have not just kept up with inflation, they have massively outrun it. And these 4 categories are exactly the ones you cannot opt out of: healthcare, housing, education, childcare. Since 1980, U.S. college tuition has risen by over 1,200%, adjusted for inflation. Healthcare costs have risen by more than 600%. Housing in major metropolitan areas has increased so dramatically that in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, or New York, a median income household cannot afford a median-priced home, not even close.
So here is the cruel math. The things that got cheaper are the things you want. The things that got more expensive are the things you need to stay healthy, to live somewhere, to educate your children, to participate in the economy as a functional adult. Your wages didn't grow. The cheap stuff got cheaper. The essential stuff got dramatically more expensive. And somehow, after all of that, you are supposed to also be saving for retirement. Part 3. The debt architecture. This is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because when wages stagnate and essential costs skyrocket, something has to give. And what gave, quietly, gradually, by design, was debt. Consumer debt in America crossed $17 trillion in 2023. The average American household carries over $100,000 in total debt. Mortgage, student loans, auto loans, credit cards. And here is the critical detail. Interest on that debt flows upward. Every month, millions of middle-class households make payments that enrich financial institutions and their shareholders. The debtor and the creditor are not peers. They never were.
Student loans are particularly elegant in their design. You take on debt at 18, before you have any real understanding of compound interest, labor markets, or the actual return on investment of various degrees. The debt is structured to be nearly impossible to discharge. It follows you. And for millions of people, it effectively functions as a tax on the ambition to get an education, paid not to the government, but to private lenders. Credit card debt operates similarly. The average credit card interest rate in the US hit 22% in 2024. That is not a financial product. At that rate, it is a trap with good branding.
The problem is that owning assets requires capital, and capital requires either inheritance, savings, or income above your cost of living. For a middle-class family whose wages have stagnated while essential costs have risen, saving is not a lifestyle choice. It is genuinely structurally difficult. Meanwhile, asset prices have been inflated by decades of low interest rates and quantitative easing policies that were explicitly designed to boost investment returns. The S&P 500 has grown by roughly 700% over the last 30 years. Real estate in most major cities has tripled or quadrupled. If you owned assets through that period, your wealth grew even when you were doing nothing. If you did not own assets, if you were renting, working, paying off student loans, you watched that wealth creation happen to other people. This is not a political statement. It is arithmetic. The top 10% of American households own approximately 89% of all stocks. The bottom 50% own essentially nothing in the market. When the Fed cuts rates and the stock market rallies, that is not good news for everyone. It is good news for the people who already own the stocks. The contrast, what we were told versus what is real. We were told, work hard, get educated, be responsible, and the system will reward you. The reality, for a significant portion of the middle class, work harder than your parents did. Take on more debt to afford the same education. Pay more for housing in absolute terms. Face higher healthcare costs with less employer coverage. Contribute to a 401k that depends on markets you do not understand. And then try to feel like a financial failure when the numbers don't work out. The gap between that promise and that reality is not a personal failing. It is a structural outcome. Here is the irony that almost makes you laugh. The advice given to middle-class people to fix this situation, invest in the market, buy real estate, start a business, is technically correct. Those things do build wealth, but they require capital to begin. And the people who most need to build wealth are the people who have the least capital to start with, because they are spending it all on the 4 categories that never stop rising. It is a ladder with the bottom rung missing.
Zoom out. What happens next? The long-term implications of this are not abstract. A middle class under sustained financial stress is a middle class that cannot absorb economic shocks. It cannot retire on time, which means it stays in the workforce longer, reducing opportunities for younger workers. It cannot fund children's education without debt, passing the structural problem to the next generation. It is more susceptible to financial scams, predatory lending, and political manipulation because financial desperation narrows the options people feel they have. There is also a macroeconomic consequence. Consumer spending drives roughly 70% of the US economy. A middle class that is spending more on debt payments and essential costs and less on discretionary consumption is a middle class that is structurally limiting its own economy's growth potential. That is not sustainable indefinitely.
The question economists are quietly debating is not whether this system creates stress. That is already established. The question is whether the system can self-correct, or whether the structural forces have compounded long enough that correction now requires intervention of a scale that no political coalition currently has the will to attempt. Here is where I will leave you. The middle class is not falling behind because it is doing something wrong. It is falling behind because it is operating inside a system where the rules, wages, debt, asset ownership, cost of essentials, have all shifted in the same direction over the same period against the same group of people. The individual solutions, budget better, invest in index funds, avoid lifestyle inflation, are real and worth doing. They are not the cause of the problem, but they are not the cure either. You cannot fully optimize your way out of a structural condition.
And here is the question I think is worth sitting with. If the middle class is the backbone of a democratic, market-based society, politically stable, economically active, upwardly mobile,
and that backbone is quietly, systematically weakening over decades, what exactly are we building toward? A society with a large, financially stressed working population and a small, asset-owning class at the top is not a new invention. History has seen it before. What history has also shown is that it tends not to stay stable forever. Whether that instability resolves through policy, through economic restructuring, or through something more disruptive, that part has not been written yet.